Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's contract administration practice session. With that, I do want to hand it back over to our co-chairs, Jim Raines and Douglas Freeman, to get started with today's topic. So, Doug and Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Welcome, everyone. Good everyone to be back here for our last in the series of the top 10 practices for construction administration.
Yeah, welcome everybody. We're glad to have you here. And Matthew, let's just jump right in. We'll get started with the topic. So we'll always like to give credit for Mr. Letterman here to establishing these top 10 CA best practices, plagiarizing Mr. Letterman a little bit. Let's take a look at the next slide. I think his well, that's the wrong way. We'll go the other way. I think his top 10 served him well, and he was pretty successful at sticking with that top 10. Here, every day is just a beach for every day is just a day at the beach for Mr. Letterman. So I hope that you can use these top 10 best practices and be just as successful. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll just take a moment to touch on, I don't know, there you go. Touch on what we have done so far. So best practice number 10 was have fun. You know, it's part of the reason I'm sure most of you got into this profession, to enjoy it. It was a part of your soul. Don't forget to plan to have fun as you're doing your job. Best practice number 9, remember your pants pockets, is all about a quality control and quality assurance program within your firm, being sure that your documents are fully vetted before they get out on the street in a bid kind of atmosphere. Best practice number 8, teamwork creates winners. You know, this is not a single player sport that we're in here. Do all you can to support your team and make everyone successful, and that's in everyone's best interest. Best practice number 7, hold costs in check. It was a discussion about paying close attention and using our own documents, particularly in the general conditions part and supplementary general conditions part of our practices, and being sure that we are following our own rules that we set, particularly with change orders, pay application processing, etc. Best practice number 6, admitting mistakes is ethically sound, but maybe not what risk management folks would say to us. You know, when you move as professionally as you can past the, you know, whodunit phase and getting into the solutions found phase of an issue, certainly shows great professionalism. We wouldn't want you to do that without talking to your liability carriers, liability insurance carriers, but certainly it moves us all in the right direction in practice when we hold our hand up and say, that's my fault. Next slide, best practice number 5, look at and use the documents. Your firm is potentially made up of people who have an experience in a lot of different places that is this is the way I've always done it experience. Don't assume that they have assimilated to your way of practice. Be sure you use your documents and look at them carefully before you speak about what individuals should see or be doing in the field. Best practice number 4, think about the end. That was a conversation about looking at the very messy, hardest to construct, hardest to understand parts of your project and figuring those out yourself rather than leaving those in the field to figure it out for you. Best practice number 3, timeliness is next to wonderfulness, was a discussion about the momentum that a project can build. Those that are successful seem to do that, and that our role is to feed that project and keep it alive and healthy by giving it answers and information as needed to keep things moving. And then last time, our best practice number 2, which is just plain listening and paying attention to what is going on more than you are talking, use those 2 ears that you have to absorb information throughout the project life. It will certainly inform you and certainly give you a firm foundation to work from as you move through the project. Which leads us then to the next slide, Matthew, and our topic for today, which is best practice number 1, which Doug and I believe that communication is absolutely everything, especially on the project. So let's look at the next slide. I want to be particular to say, email, please don't confuse that with communication. I can't stand that stuff. People say things in emails. They assume individuals are duly notified when they hit send. They document poorly. They spell terribly. I'm one of those. And they create fodder for later use on the projects, which is something that may come back to haunt them terribly, depending on what they've said. And Doug, I'll stop for a second. I'm sure you might be able to touch on things that people have heard in court that they couldn't believe they said themselves.
Yeah, that is true. Email is discoverable. It is not something that you can keep from the other side. You have to turn that information over. And people often, as Jim was mentioning, are cavalier about email and what they say in emails. So you need to be very careful about using email. It's widely used today with the technology now, but you need to be extremely careful about how you use it. I would strongly suggest you get with your risk management folks, your attorneys, your insurance carriers, and come up with policies and procedures for your office in terms of how and when to use email so that you can use it effectively, because you will be using it. But you need to use it in a manner to where it's not going to get you in trouble. Just shooting off the little funny jokes and the video clips and all of that stuff is discoverable, and all of that could go to create some very embarrassing moments if you have to talk about some of that stuff in the course of a litigation.
That's right. Let's go to the next slide, Matthew. And what Doug and I want to talk about today are those things that we refer to as communication and what that looks like during the construction phase of the project. So on the next slide, we are referencing here AIA documents in AIA A201 to touch on, if in fact those are documents that you may be using, what are the expectations placed upon us as practitioners, architects, engineers. From our perspective, one of the things that we are obligated to do, if that is our contractual umbrella, is to keep the owner informed. And that is very much through communication. I think, also we play a role in helping the owner and the contractor to communicate. So not only are we communicators directly with our client, but we serve as a conduit of sorts between the owner and the contractor, so that we are informed and engaged and understand exactly where the project is and where project concerns, issues, or opportunities exist. These are all things that could be written, sure, but our experience in conversational sharing is critical to the project and to this requirement for staying aware and keeping individuals informed. And That's not to say that documentation isn't important. Please don't take this as a commentary on just talking, because critical project information needs to be documented, captured, and shared. But here we're talking about those opportunities for conversational engagement. And I'm sure that you have experiences on projects where you have had contractors or clients that you enjoyed talking with, that you built relationships with, and there is a trust factor there that is difficult to create in other environments than just direct communication. Let's look at the next slide and see, Matthew, if there are any questions or comments, or Doug, is there anything you want to add in there?
Nothing to add, Jim. Anything from the group, Matthew, at this point?
Nope, the group is pretty quiet at the moment.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little about expectations from the parties of the team, and start with the construction community. And the contractor's expectation is, as we talked about in Teamwork Creating Winners, we need to be responsive. As designers, architects, engineers, interior designers, we need to be responsive. And often, there's a real opportunity to get answers to the project verbally with a phone call. And when those answers, let me start over. After the phone call, properly documenting that communication is critical, particularly when you're answering questions, when you're discussing modifications or changes, schedule, anything that may be impactful to the project. The documentation that follows that communication is important. But there have been many opportunities for me to make a quick phone call to say yes, to say no, to say proceed, to say it should be at this elevation or it should be this color we select. And being prompt with those was very easy from wherever I was, particularly now with the type of communication devices we have. And then a follow-up document could be sent later when I had that opportunity. So this is verbal communication and follow-up written communication that we're talking about at the same time. Let's take a look at the next slide, Matthew. Not only does the contractor have certain expectations of us, but also the owner does, and we touched on that a second ago. We are their representative and their eyes and ears, overseer of their interests. So that's a web of communication defined there between parties. We've talked about this before in some of these webinars where, for example, we talked last time about down chain communications with not just the project manager, but the superintendent, maybe the foreperson, and maybe the installers in the field. I'm a big talker, and I enjoy getting to know those people. Those can be personal conversations and don't have to be project related. They may become that as you form those friendships and connections. And again, they need to be documented when they are related to the project itself. And as others have pointed out in other webinars, you do not want to supersede authority and management in having these kinds of communications. But being on the project and being communicative is certainly something that our clients and the owner expects of us. Doug, any additional thoughts?
Make sure that you keep in mind the proper lines of communication. Jim and I both encourage interaction, conversations, cultivating friendships with everyone on a job site. But you need to make sure that if you are acting in an official capacity and giving direction, that needs to go through the proper channels. Don't go to your buddy that is installing the floor tile and tell him, change the floor pattern a little bit. That needs to go through the project manager. So while we encourage and think it's very beneficial to have those conversations with everyone on the site, you just need to keep in mind, be mindful that when you're acting in an official capacity on an action that needs to happen on the job site, that you need to make sure you follow the proper lines of communication.
That's right. Go ahead, Doug.
I was going to ask Matthew to go to the next slide and see if we had any comments yet.
We just had one comment here from Aladdin saying, can you cover questions at the end of the presentation and encourage attendees to send them in for answers at the end? We will address additional questions at the end, Aladdin. We just try to, if there's anything that's specific to the content that's on the slide, make sure that we can address that conversation as we go. So with that, obviously, if somebody has a larger scale question, feel free to drop that in. We'll keep those to the end. However, if you have questions that relate directly to what we're talking about, feel free to type those in as you go, and we will keep interjecting them if they make sense as we present the rest of the topic.
Well, as we're saying and continuing through this conversational part of communication, we all spend so much of our life involved with the projects, and often are so focused on getting answers and moving to the next thing that we forget about the relationship that we have built or are building. And one of the things that Doug and I talk about as we have done this together is just calling to say hello, calling to check in, calling to talk about something that may not be particular to the project. I have friends, I'm proud to say, that I have developed on project sites that I'm excited to see on other project sites, that I'm excited to see in professional settings when we participate in the Association of General Contractors events or in supplier events, in trade shows. Doug and I have friends all over the place that we're very proud to say we know that some history of their families or where they have been in their career. Just think about the complexity of where people work, how they move, at least our experience, how they move from firm to firm on the construction side, on the architectural side, on the owner side. So if you try to develop a practice of just checking in, calling the project manager just to say hello, and sure, the job might come up. They might talk about what a nice sunny day it is and how they've been able to make good progress. Do the same with your client. We forget that often our phone call is to deliver some maybe not so good news, to ask for additional money, to explain why we may have made a mistake. I like getting calls that are from friends that talk about happy news, and I think that our clients do too. We build these relationships over such a long period of time. Doug and I like to make friends whenever we can on a job site, and that is not for any kind of motive other than communicating and establishing relationships. There's no ulterior, it'll be better for me when things get bad. It's just, again, as we've talked about before, living your life on the project like you live your life outside of work. Seems pretty logical to us to apply to what we do on the job.
And it goes back to best practice number 10, have fun.
That's exactly right. Because sometimes you need some help getting out of the mud, and I mean that literally and figuratively. So when you've had a good time with folks, they don't mind helping you. Let's look at the next slide, Matthew. So how do our contract documents relate to our professional relationships? Well, our position as construction administrators we are charged to be fair and impartial, which can often be very, very difficult. It's easy to be professional when the client is paying for our fees and we've got to go and say, this is something that you need to pay more for, and not just automatically turn and try to place that on the contractor's shoulders. That's a difficult conversation. If you've done some of these things we're talking about today, it makes it a whole lot easier, I can promise you. Well, in order to set a foundation for that, we've got to be clear, and we've got to be very complete about what we communicate. So, we spend our time on the project sitting on that fence and not being on one side or the other. So we're communicating in all directions completely and clearly. And we'll talk some about complete and clear conversation as we move through this. But these opportunities will certainly help in the most difficult days as you go weathering through those on projects. So let's take a look at the next slide and talk about a couple of examples of communication that are requests for interpretations, or as we like to refer to them, they're broadly referred to as RFIs, requests for information. But we put this in to distinguish a little bit about what communication is like and what those two things are. So an interpretation is an explanation of something that and information is usually a fact or a detail about a subject. So you see those there. There is a difference. One is refining maybe what is already there, and one is a sharing of knowledge about a detail or subject. And they are described differently. We broadly call RFIs as such, but often that is not what we should be calling them. So let's look at one of our CSI forms on the next slide, which is a request for interpretation form. So what is that? Well, it's a request someone has made, and in fact, Doug has talked about this in the past, that we could do this ourselves. It's not very typical, but we could. And it documents what should be a limitation to an interpretation of the documents that is something that may need further clarification on the part of the construction community, or more documentation for them to understand. And it may be that it's a provision of something that's missing, but it is a request to get more detail. Doug, I don't know if you want to talk about anything more with interpretations.
I don't think so, Jim, not unless we've got some issues or questions from the group. I will just speak a little bit about the comment you made that you said I often have spoken in the past about us meaning the design team or the design professional issuing an RFI. That was something that was first brought to my attention several years ago at a seminar I was at. And I went back and looked at the documents, and the documents do not say anything about an RFI having to come from the contractor. In fact, I think it specifically mentions the contractor and owner may issue an RFI, but it doesn't exclude that a design professional might not do the same thing. And what was suggested at that seminar was if you're dealing with the contractor and you need some information from him, why wouldn't it be appropriate for you to send an RFI to him? And an example of that might be if he hasn't submitted his schedule, or you've got a question about his schedule. How are you going to have this task occur at this point in the sequence that you've got on your schedule when you need to have something else happen as a precedent and is showing up coming as later? So those would be some examples of where I would think that a design professional or an architect might send an RFI to a contractor. I've never done it. I don't know if I've ever seen it done, but it's something to think about.
Matthew, any hands raised or questions?
No, the only question we had was regarding a copy of today's slides. For those that haven't noticed, in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel, there should be a PDF for you to be able to download that is the slides for today's session already. Other than that, the audience has been quiet.
Cool. Well, let's take a look at the next slide. I love this. And it goes to discuss exactly how specific we should communicate. Well, you could say you need the use of a wheelchair. I would suspect that the one on the left would be more advantageous than the one on the right. But some might argue that they both would qualify under that definition. So it's just an image that I have seen that certainly defines how specifically we should communicate, no matter what we're doing on the project. But let's look at the next slide and remember that as we are communicating, not to forget best practice number 2, which we talked about last month, which is to listen more than we talk, because that is a real opportunity both as a professional to learn and as a manager, as a representative of your client to look after their best interests on the project. So let's move to the next slide, and another nod towards that listening. The maze that we walk with these projects often is complicated with a language barrier for many folks. And whether that is a language barrier for us as the administrator to communicate and be able to understand on the project what is happening, or it is a barrier for us to be able to share the information that we're trying to share. It certainly can be either way. So let's take a look at the next slide, and is it just talk then that we are discussing here out on the project? No, it's not. It's not just talk. Let's go to the next slide. The language, whether it is a language of English versus something else, is not really the only consideration for communication. I don't know how many of you have the opportunity to spend time in a quality control or quality assurance process within your firms, or how many of you have that opportunity to do that with your clients. I'll speak just personally about experiences that I've had where quality control went on with the client's personnel at the client's facility. And being a consultant to a group and not in charge of managing the meeting, I often have had the opportunity to stand back and watch the individuals who are participating. And what I've learned over time is, for example, we all have our own languages, and whether it's on the architects or engineers side where we're talking about rebar sizes and foundations, or we're working in hospitals and the radiant flux of a floor tile is important for various static electricity issues. What HVAC means, or AFF, we banter around these terms in conversational settings, and they mean something to us, but our clients might not have a clue what it is we're talking about. So we're talking about communication throughout the project, whether we're in the field, whether we're in their office, whether we're in the design phase, or we're finishing construction. The clients have terms that they use that may be foreign to us as well. What's ROI, and how do we figure out a cost to benefit ratio on something that they're looking at doing? Supply chain management and what happens with products for those that may be working in retail or food kind of restaurant settings. These languages that are shared are maybe foreign to many who are trying to listen. So being aware of that and taking the time to educate the participants is critical to the success of your project. My observations have been that people are embarrassed to raise their hand and say, I'm sorry, I don't know what HVAC means. Because when in occasions when they have been explained the point and what that stands for, it has raised issues such as, well, we have a standard here on our campus for train equipment, and that's what we want to use here. That's the only thing we'll accept. Does that matter? Well, if you're in a design bid build market and using state funds, you bet it does in North Carolina, and that leads to a whole different kind of bidding document and bidding procedure, documentation, specification creation. You may say, well, that's on the design side, not the CA side. But it ends up on the CA side if that communication isn't very explicit and well-defined during the design process. So, what about your local media in projects that have that opportunity to be on TV, or you're doing zoning and planning variations and special use permits? How is their language different from what we use? Anybody that's had any kind of news information shared about a project realizes that maybe better communication could have helped that story. And then with code officials, what is that language? And inspections and what they are looking for. So this communication isn't just talk, and it isn't just a language that may be from an origin of where we were born or how we grew up, but it is embedded within the very facts and figures that we use in the performance of our job. So let's take a look at the next slide. And
as you move on to the next slide, I would want to piggyback on that and caution folks to be careful when they use acronyms like HVAC. I'm just sitting here thinking, even within our industry, they can be confusing. As you could be talking about a CO, and in one sentence you're talking about a change order, and then in the next sentence you're talking about a certificate of occupancy, and they're both COs. CD, is it construction documents? Is it contract documents? Is it a certificate of deposit? Is it a compact disc? So be careful when you use acronyms, especially ones that might be more specific to our industry, because it's likely that folks outside of our industry might have the same acronym that means something totally different.
That's absolutely right. Well, so what's the opportunity here? We continue to stay focused on this is just time spent talking and talking it all together, creating that picture. You know, we haven't even touched on how potentially confusing and misunderstood our documents themselves are, and how our clients might not be able to see the image of what we're trying to portray. Certainly with modeling, building modeling, we have come a long ways to avoiding that miscommunication, but that talking together of the project, it builds these bonds. They're just very strong bridges between what we have tried to create as an image and what our client ends up with as a permanent structure, and what the contractor is dedicated to put together to help us, in the end, reach our client's goals and expectations. So let's take a look at the next slide, and this is a slide that is put into the mix for a very specific story. This is a very personal story, and one that taught me a valuable lesson. So what you see in the image is the interior of a library project that I was working on. And I had the opportunity to be with my family off on a trip. We were returning home on a weekend, and we were driving by this building. So I was going to stop and show my family what I was working on, brag a little bit about what Dad does on these trips when he's away. And as I came around the corner of this property, there was black smoke pouring out of the windows of this building under construction, and it literally looked like it was on fire. I apologize for the image here not being the best, and not being large enough to really appreciate the amount of smoke that's being generated by that fire in that barrel. So I run into the building, and this gentleman here was a foreman on a project. His name's Jose, and Jose referred to me as Mr. Jim. We had a great working relationship, very dedicated craftsman on this project, who was responsible for, in the end, the beautiful result that turned out from this project. So Jose and I became good friends, and so when I walked in, he was very excited to see me. Came over, we gave each other a big hug. How you doing? It's great. And I said, Jose, what's going on here? And he was a very proud of his work and the craft and the amount of time that he put into the things that he did on projects. He said, come over here, come Mr. Jim, I'm going to show you exactly what I'm doing. I'm so happy that you came here today. So he began to point to the things that are captured in this image that are a little bit difficult to see, but what he's working on immediately there is a copper-coated flashing that is in a small roll, laying out on a 2x4. He had some adhesive strip, which is very hard to see on a box there, that went with metal panels that went onto the building. He has some cementitious adhesive, it's not grout, that's in a little small white bucket there to the left of the image. And then a vapor barrier, which is the white-looking box structure standing up there in the middle of the image. And so his excitement was based around his attentive listening to our pre-installation comments in our pre-installation meeting. The exterior skin was about to go on this building, and we had talked about all of the components in that meeting that would make up the exterior skin. And so on this day, Jose was there to begin working on parts of that erection. Now, he was by himself. There was nobody else there. I don't know how he was going to effectively do any of this work, but the outside temperature when I made this visit was around 20 degrees, 22 degrees, something like that. It was bitterly cold. And so as Jose described to me what he was there doing, my light bulb started to come on, a slight glow at first until I finally understood. What we had talked about in the pre-installation meeting at one point was that the temperature had to be 40 degrees and rising in order to do certain parts of the work and in order to install certain parts of the work. So he reminded me of that, and he said, I built this fire to meet the project specifications. Well, I forgot to explain that this is a LEED building, and so when he told me that, I looked up at the ceiling. I think the ones that hang down from the top of a cave are called stalactites, and there was black soot stalactites hanging all over the area above this barrel. And so I asked, what are you burning in there? And he pointed to the black roll of felt right beside the vapor barrier and said, the roofer who's finished on the project left me some great fuel for my fire. Mr. Jim, these things burn really well when you throw them in there on a fire. So his fuel was the building felt rolls that had been left behind. And as I started then to look at what was happening, this rolled copper had asphalt to one side of it, and about every 6 inches where he had unrolled it, of course it had cracked. It was frozen solid when he took it inside, but it was starting to be a little malleable. And I asked him about the bucket, which is adhesive, and he said, well, that's the second one out of the box. The first one I had gotten too close to the barrel, and the plastic bucket is in melted. But boy, Mr. Jim, that stuff burns really well too, because I just threw that right in the barrel to stoke the fire. So Jose's entire intention here on this day was to bring these materials themselves up to 40 degrees. That's what he felt like he was doing. And more importantly, that's what he heard me say. I think this is my fault, because I didn't communicate clearly. I didn't set the image in Jose's mind of what 40 degrees and rising meant. And he was very methodically and intently doing his best to bring these materials up to what he thought was 40 degrees. In fact, there's a thermometer that's in this area. It's behind the bucket holding up the flashing. And he is doing everything he can to comply with our verbal conversation during this pre-installation meeting. So I share that story because I think it's so poignant about what we do, who we speak with, what their language is. You know, Jose spoke good English, not his native language. I'm sure it was difficult to hear me speak and understand all the things that I was trying to share with that group during this pre-installation meeting. I shouldn't say we. I'll start over and say I. I don't think about the audience as much as I should. It was not long after this that I started to talk about translation of documents. And we've talked about that on these webinars. Great questions come after that statement, like, if the documents are translated, who is responsible then for mistakes in that translation? How do you get paid for that and that extra step? And how do you find a way to be sure that the words that you need to use for your specifications translate directly? Those are really good questions, and I don't have answers for them. I know that Doug has done some looking at that in the past in trying to respond to those questions, but there are opportunities, I think, in our industry that are centered around communication that I hope we as groups, as CSI or AGC or the Professional Engineers Associations, the AIA, embrace and start to look at as time goes forward. So this is a vivid story for me about communication. One that I learned an important lesson based around, and I'll hush. So, Matthew, anybody that has asked questions, you can share those, and Doug, anything that you want to add to as well, please.
Jim, I don't have anything to add. I love this story. I love this slide. Thanks for sharing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the audience. The audience is still pretty quiet here. So, reminder for anyone that has any questions or comments, feel free to type them in. But at this point, we can move on. So.
Okay. Well, so this is our last prepared slide, and before we talk about what's next, but there is no marketing less expensive or more impactful than being there with your client, holding their hand throughout this project from whatever this project is, from beginning to end, and communicating with them in very deliberate, clear, specific detail at every step along the way. What is happening, what is about to happen, what just happened, all of that based in a firm and clear process of communicating, storytelling, and hand-holding is what I believe is the best marketing money out there. and since you're there anyway, it sure is inexpensive.
Doug? Well, as we're wrapping up, I just want to reemphasize, I cannot say enough how important good communication is on a project. I think Jim's story helped illustrate that. I did a little bit of looking and found an article from a insurance provider, it's Finance Insurance Limited, that talks about communication and failures to communicate. And some years ago, and Jim, you will probably remember, one of the leading causes for claims for design professionals had to do with contract terms. That we were signing contracts that the terms were not favorable, and we've addressed that with the AIA producing their standard form documents and other organizations, CSI, helping out and putting together standard form documents so that the incidence of claims because of bad contract terms has declined drastically. Following that, it seemed to me, and I think history will prove out, that the majority of claims then started dealing with the building envelope. Windows leaking, roofs leaking, exterior insulation finish systems failing, so we had a rush of issues with building envelopes. And we've addressed that. So it seems like currently most claims can be tied back now to failures in communication. And I'm looking at this article, and it's stating that nearly a third of all claims, a contributing factor is failure in communication. So again, I can't stress how important it is. You need to do it internally with your staff. You need to do it internally with the whole design team. You need to do it, as Jim said, with the owner. And you need to do it with the construction team. Very important. It can be very rewarding and very satisfying as we talk about communicating on job sites with all the workers and developing relationships and building friendships. So I just wanted to emphasize that as we wrap up. Matthew, let's go to the next slide.
Were there any questions, Matthew, to follow up?
No, at this point the audience is still quiet.
Well, as we've talked about, we are always interested in everyone's input and your ideas for a basis of presentation and discussion, deliberation here. So before we close, you'll see our email addresses. Please send us your thoughts and your ideas about items to discuss. There are our email addresses there. We certainly want to delve into topics that are of interest. Maybe they're particular to your firm. Maybe they're conversations about things that you have experienced, and we can do those anonymously if you want to. But any ideas that you have, we certainly would love to hear them, and we'd love to dig into them. And I'll say my thank you for your participation this year, your tolerance in going through these one at a time, and if there's ever anything that Doug or I could do to clarify or follow up, we certainly would be glad to do that. And I'll hush and turn it over to Doug.
I echo Jim's comments. Thanks everyone for participating. We do hope that we will hear from you with some suggestions for topics for next year. And again, thank you, and I hope everyone has a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
All right. Well, thank you again, Jim and Douglas, for today's session as well as this entire series. Again, thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in January. Have a happy holidays and a Happy New Year. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.